Okay, caller, you are live on the air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Thanks. My name is Trey. I'm from Oklahoma.
Welcome, Trey. What is the question for Rabbi?
So I'm trying to write a short story I'm calling Mostly Dead, maybe for a film or something. And so I have a question about the three synoptic gospels and a theory I've heard that they may have been based on maybe like a first passion play that was done to show the gospels to people that weren't literate. Wonder if the rabbi has any thoughts on that theory.
Are you asking the question, were the gospels preceded by oral stories about Jesus and then someone came to write them down? Is that what your question essentially is?
You rephrased it beautifully.
Excellent.
The answer is absolutely. The answer is that the synoptic gospels, the word synoptic is just two Greek words, synoptic with one view, because the first three gospels are, we'll just say they're similar. And they share a lot of features in common. But for sure, there was an oral tradition that predated the written text. In fact, I'll go further. There was another written text that predated, that's older than Mark, and it's lost. There's no question about that. I'm not going to go into how you can know it, but looking at the book of Mark and just getting rid of Matthew and Luke, just looking at Mark, it's very clear that he's writing on an earlier canvas because the narrator in Mark is adding something to it. And you could see it's very transparent. The reason why people don't see that in Mark is not because they're not as smart as me. It's because everyone on this planet that's read the book of Mark, all 679 passages, has already read the book of Matthew. And reading the book of Matthew before Mark colors the view of Mark, because you read Matthew, so you're reading Matthew into Mark, so that's a big problem. And number two is you have a Q source, which is very old, meaning that there are, I would say about 40% of the book of Luke is from the book of Mark. In fact, Luke and Matthew both take almost all of Mark and use those passages in their Gospels, which are considerably longer. Luke does it a little bit more than Matthew both do. But one of the striking things that we find is that there are 235 passages that are common to Matthew and Luke that don't appear anywhere in the book of Mark. That means that there was a source that Matthew and Luke were relying, because Matthew never read Luke and Luke never read Matthew. I know it sounds crazy, but they didn't. If they had, they would have written their text differently. So they're both looking at a source that we don't have any longer. It only survives through Matthew and Luke. There's, again, more than 200 passages that are only in Matthew and Luke that are not found in Mark at all. And they're exactly what you'd expect them to be. They're called the Q source, but you call it what you want. But they are sayings of Jesus. Sayings of Jesus. So we could see that's a little bit more primitive than the Gospels that are more embellished. And now the fact that the earliest Christians were completely illiterate is attested to in the Christian Bible itself. In Acts chapter 4, verse 13, it's stated explicitly that Peter and John were literally, in Greek, literally unlettered. That means they were completely illiterate. And what would you expect from fishermen from the northern Galilee? You would not expect literacy from there. You might expect some literacy from Tiberias, but that's not where Jews were to be found at that period of time. So there's no doubt that there were all kinds of oral stories about Jesus floating all over the Levant and well beyond. And different communities adopted different ideas. And we could see that conflict spilling right into the Christian Bible. Every letter of Paul contains a conflict between Paul and fellow Christians about what is the true Christology, what's the true gospel, why are they fighting? Because there's all these oral traditions that are floating everywhere. And gospel writers will adopt some ideas and reject others. So you have Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:7 as an example, identifying Jesus as our Passover, meaning identifying Jesus with the lamb of Passover. So you find that in a letter written in the 50s. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic gospels, know nothing about this and have the Passover Seder as the Last Supper, which wouldn't work. But John picks up on this idea that Paul picked up on. These ideas are just floating out there. He switches the Last Supper to one night earlier, so it's not a Passover Seder, and therefore the Eucharist in John is not at the Last Supper in John chapter 13, but rather it's in John chapter 6. So here you have a very interesting story of John picking up on an oral tradition that Paul picked up on. The high Christology found in the common Christian, Philippians 2:6-11. Jesus did not see equality with God something to be grasped, to be taken, and therefore God elevates him. It's a high Christology. You don't find any of that stuff in the Synoptic Gospels, but you find that high Christology in the book of John. So absolutely, it is these oral traditions that are floating from Greece to Rome and beyond. They are then redacted numerous times until we get the book of Mark. Mark is nothing more than a passion narrative with a elaborate introduction, no infancy narratives, and no resurrection appearances of Jesus. Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 8. And then the oral stories, the story just kept building and building, and you know what happens. You play the game telephone, and then you have the virgin birth entering in Matthew and Luke and so on. So absolutely did begin with oral stories, and then someone came to write it down. So thank you for your question.
Good point. Good point. That's probably why there's so many contradictions amongst the Gospels.
That's exactly correct. In different communities, people think that people just had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the first century. They didn't. They were written at some point, at the very, very end of the first century. But one community only had the book of Mark. I write about this in Let's Get Biblical, Volume 1. There were just certain communities that only had the book of Mark. They didn't know anything about Matthew, and there were people who just knew Luke. It was just a different community. And there was a Joannian community that just knew John. 90% of John is found nowhere in the Synoptic Gospels. And then this gets teased out, and you'll have later scribes who adjust each gospel to conform to the other gospel to some degree. Example, Luke 22:19-20, half of 19, all of 20 is interpolated to match the Eucharist found in the other gospels. So there's going to be some playing around with the text, but everyone's coming in, and our first source that these are the four Gospels and no other, and a strong emphasis on no other, is Irenaeus about the year 180, a very interesting church father who actually came from the East. He came from Asia Minor, meaning modern-day Turkey, essentially, but wound up in the West, in modern-day France. He was the Bishop of Lyon. And it is him. He's very, very, perhaps one of the three most important church fathers it was him that said, these are the four, and that's it. And that would have an enormous impact on how Christians would think about Christology. So good question. Thank you.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא